Everyone all right? Good. Okay, so welcome everybody to the first meeting this term of the London Assembly Housing Committee. We're here being webcast live now. Members of the public can follow at London Assembly on Twitter and use the hashtag London Housing for this meeting if they want to follow on. And please can I remind everyone participating to turn off your mobile phones or put them onto silent. Vibrations will be picked up by the desk microphones as well. So welcome. Before I start, I just wanted to say a few words of thank you to our previous chair, former Assembly member Murad Qureshi, and all the committee members for the work that they were doing, some of which they've left us a legacy of some excellent research, which we'll be picking up on later on. We look forward to building on their excellent work. We will be formally noting a number of actions in the agenda later in this meeting, but I would like to highlight particularly the joint work of the Housing Committee and the Fire, Resilience and Emergency Planning Committee on building safety. We wrote to the Minister and we've received a reply on that, which is in the papers. Also, their continued focus on rough sleeping, which has been particular importance during the pandemic. This term, we've already raised the issue of renters' rights, Section 21 no-fault evictions in the Renters Reform Bill with the Secretary of State, Robert Jenrick, and we have received a reply, which is not reflected in the papers today. It didn't arrive in time for the agenda, but we'll put it on the agenda next time. So we've made a good start already. So turning to today's work, we know that one of the most important issues facing London is how cities will tackle the climate emergency, reduce their own climate emissions, and we know that the Mayor's committed to making London a carbon neutral city by 2030. London's homes are responsible for 1/3 of our greenhouse gases, so we think it's important that the Housing Committee looks at that and how the capacity of the housing providers and the housing industry are able to sort that out. So we'll be discussing that later on. Moving on to the formal business then, can I ask our clerk, Diane Richards, to confirm any apologies for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chair. Apologies have been received from Assembly Member Sem Moema, for whom Assembly Member Anne Clark will be substituting today.
Thank you. Thanks for coming in. Right, item 2, which is declarations of interest. Can we note the list of offices held by Assembly members, and can I also ask members if they have any disclosable pecuniary interests on any specific items listed in the agenda? No? Okay, excellent. I should note that I am a councillor in the London Borough of Camden, where Councillor Adam Harrison is the executive member. That's not a conflict of interest, but it's an interest that I should declare. Item 3, membership of the committee. Can we note the membership and chairing arrangements as agreed by the London Assembly on the 14th of May 2021?
Noted.
Thank you, Team. Item 4 is our terms of reference. Can we note the terms of reference as agreed by the London Assembly on the 14th of May 2021?
Noted.
Thank you very much. Item 5 is standing delegations. Can we note the standing delegations of authority to me as chair of the committee as agreed by the London Assembly on the 14th of May 2021?
Noted.
Thank you very much. There's a lot of formal business from the first meeting. Item 6 is the minutes of the last meeting. Can we confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 9th of February 2021?
Confirmed.
Thank you. And item 7 is the summary list of actions, which I already mentioned. Can we note the completed, outstanding and closed actions arising from previous meetings of the committee and the additional correspondence sent and received?
Noted.
Thank you. Item 8 is the Mayor's response to 5 steps to build on everyone in London report. Can we note the response from the Mayor of London to the committee's report?
Noted.
Thank you. That brings us to our main item of business today. We're doing an investigation into decarbonising London's homes and the challenge of retrofitting the existing homes in London. So can I welcome today our guests who are predominantly in the chamber and thank them for joining us today. We have Shirley Rodriguez, who is the Deputy Mayor for Environment and Energy. Thank you for being here. We have Susan French, who's the Chief Executive of Barnsbury Housing Association and Vice Chair of the G320 group of small and medium housing associations. We have Councillor Adam Harrison, who is the Cabinet Member for a Sustainable Camden in the London Borough of Camden, as I mentioned earlier. And we have Bradley Tully, who is the Senior Public Affairs Officer from the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors. Thank you for being here. And then remotely, we have James Hardy, who is the Head of Energy for the Greater London Authority, here in support of Shirley and her work. Can you hear us all right, James? And you're right. Excellent.
Very well, thank you.
If you want to join in, we'll be speaking to you later on. Great. So, moving on to the questions of the day, I will start with you, Shirley, if that's all right. We know you have to leave at 11 o'clock, so we're going to focus initially quite a lot of questions on you as Deputy Mayor. And my questions to begin with are really the absolute basics of what's zero carbon home, how much does it cost? So starting with that first question, really, how do you define a carbon neutral home when it comes to homes that already exist and refitting them? Is this based on achieving a specific energy performance certificate rating? And is that different as a standard from what happens with new homes?
Well, thank you for inviting me to talk about this really important topic. It's absolutely critical that every sector takes action on climate change, reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. And housing, as Assembly Member Berry mentioned, is responsible for about a third of London's emissions. So a huge sector, but a really difficult one, and I'm sure you'll hear that from everybody, including myself and James, about how difficult it is to tackle that area. In terms of what do we mean by carbon neutral home, what we try to do is reduce as much as possible the energy demand from the home. So that's through things like insulation, but then also trying to make sure that the energy used in the home is as zero carbon as possible. So ideally through renewable energy, but increasingly our grid is being decarbonised. It's one of the sort of success stories that we have. So eventually we would hope that's fully decarbonised. So then that sort of nets off both areas basically, and that gives you the zero carbon home. However, and ideally, what we'd like is that the home produces more energy than it uses. So it actually becomes a sort of it helps others to offset their energy production or greenhouse gas production. In terms of EPCs, they're not the same, because EPCs, when you if you buy a home or even rent now, they're really just about how much it costs in terms of running the home. So it's not really a good measure of the impact it has on carbon or much on energy performance. So there are other newer approaches that we think would be better as a carbon metric, or generally about the house or building performance.
And so is that different for a new home than it is for an existing home? If you're talking about carbon neutral standards, it must be very hard to get a home that already exists down to true zero.
Yeah, so in the London plan, we have a series of actions that we seek developers to use, and there's a sort of hierarchy that they go through. And ultimately, there is a mechanism to offset any emissions through a financial payment. Anything that they can't minimise through use of renewable energy, sort of heat pumps and so on, or through the fabric, the building insulation.
So if they get down as low as they can, and they also make a payment for anything that's left?
At the moment, yes.
Right.
But ideally, over time, we're going to be getting much better methods of construction and retrofitting, which we'd hope would mean there's no need for an offsetting payment. But I guess Bradley's probably better qualified at being able to give you a bit more information about that.
Okay, no, that's all right. Can we ask you, though, what analysis you've been doing of the scale of need in London? We've got 3.5 million homes, approximately, most of which already exist. They need some form of retrofitting to achieve the Mayor's carbon goals. What is the need in terms of the number of homes needed to treat and the amount of work involved?
Well, to get to our climate targets, whether it's 2050, the UK government's new target, then or the Mayor's, pretty much every home is going to need to have some form of retrofitting. The social housing sector, there's 750,000 homes that need to be retrofitted. We've done an analysis, the London stock building stock model, that looks at the sort of EPC ratings to give us a sort of proxy of how poor or well they're doing on energy efficiency. And we have a really complicated system in London of housing tenure, lots of flats, solid walls, conservation areas, all of these things make it really difficult to crack the retrofitting of our homes and to make them more fuel efficient, let alone zero carbon.
And have you done an analysis of, you said basically all the homes need to be treated, so that's 3.5 million homes need something doing.
Yeah, and they'll need different things. Some will need a massively intensive approach, a whole house retrofit, which is some of the things that we've been working on through our accelerators. Others that have been more newly built, that have been following, for example, London Plan standards, will have less of an issue. They're sort of pretty efficient at the moment, but over time, if we're really going to get as much out of all of our homes to contribute to that target, then there may be things that they need to do as well.
And have you done any analysis of the cost of all of this at a London level?
At a high level. So when we did the action plan for a 1.5 degree action plan, the Paris compliant action plan, we estimated that to get to that plan, it would need £61 billion worth of spend, basically, to tackle our infrastructure. That's not all on homes, but it's pretty much mostly on homes or the related infrastructure. So it's things like insulation, heat pumps, boilers, some of the energy infrastructure that will be needed as well. And there's a little bit in there about the sort of the transport infrastructure. But these numbers vary a lot because it depends on what people take into account in terms of measures, how difficult to treat the homes are. So, that's an estimate. We've seen other estimates, in across the UK of sort of 500 billion, lots and lots of cost. And I think that's really what we're trying to do now, is to get a better assessment of what's needed. So we've been funding, for example, some work with London councils to look at their social housing stock, to see what that might cost to get to a better energy efficiency rating and zero carbon. We are updating our modelling for the 1.5 degree plan to look at the what impact that has in terms of the pace and scale of change that we need, and also some costs. We've been talking to organisations like the Green Finance Institute and others, really about the sort of financial mechanisms that we're going to have to bring to play. So whilst there is some government grant to help with this, and I'm sure we'll come on to talk about that, the sums, the scale of the order of sums that we need means that we really are looking at the private sector finance flows that we need to be moving, along with lots of other things around transportation, or a lot of the other sort of resilience of our infrastructure that we also need to look at in terms of overheating or flash flooding.
So that's, just to reiterate, you've got an estimate of £61 billion for London over a timescale of less than 10 years now?
No, that would be for the 2050 target, so that would be probably 20 years, I think. But what we're doing is updating that modelling.
Yes, to bring forward, because the Mayor's target is now 2030.
That's right, yeah.
But presumably it'll be roughly the same amount in sort of order of magnitude, but over a much shorter time period.
Well, given the time period is contracted, it may be more expensive because you're trying to do more quicker. But we have new technologies that are coming on all the time. But we still have a lot of technologies like heat pumps that are not really being trialled at scale. And it's a bit like some of the conversations we'll have about the innovation partnership. The cost of retrofitting a home is, very simply, is I don't know, something like £50,000, I think. But if you were to do a whole house deep retrofit, it's much more expensive, probably double, if not more. But if you do these things at scale, then you can bring the costs down, and that's really what we're trying to do through that mechanism.
We'll talk more about your initiatives later. But just in very broad terms, what goals has the Mayor set in his new manifesto for how much retrofitting will get done during this mayoral term, which, as we know, is only 3 years rather than the usual 4? Yeah,
so we have programme targets for the things like the accelerators that we've set up. and obviously, as we look to, there's an overall target of which we're updating, as I said, for the 2030 new target in terms of our 1.5 degree plan. So there's an aspiration for all homes to be retrofitted, but that really is subject to powers, funding, supply chain, and of course, as I mentioned, the difficulties of working in London, in terms of the stock that we have. So there are so many different tenures and types of stock. They all need pretty much an individual plan for how you would treat them, and a costing, and then how do you mobilise around those. So all of that needs an assessment. So
Yeah.
I can't give you a target.
No, that's what this whole meeting's about. But do you have an assessment of what's sort of currently in train within the current programme?
Yeah,
just as the broad total of homes you might treat.
I haven't got a total, but I can certainly send you the detail. But for example, our Retrofit Accelerator on homes is looking to do 1,678 homes to be supported by mid-22. Our Warmer Homes programme, which is giving grants to low-income households for energy efficiency measures. We've already supported 1,157. We're looking to support another 1,188 during the second phase, which ends this year. So those are two. We'll obviously ask more detail about those programmes.
Mm-hmm. Just in broad terms then, we've got millions of homes that need to be treated, and so far, under the current, the abilities that we have to raise money, we're doing ones of thousands. So this is the difference that we just want to get across at this beginning of this meeting. That's really helpful.
No, it's an absolute challenge, and it's absolute challenge that the UK faces. This isn't just a London issue, and this is why so many of the sort of advocacy that we, UK 100, local authorities, London councils, LGA, really pressing, and obviously the private sector pressing for some long-term certainty from government about the policies and the programmes to meet those targets, for their own target, the UK's target, let alone any accelerated targets that we and other local authorities have set. It is a massive challenge, but I think we have done these things before, and I think it is really just trying to put these sort of frameworks in place to get that sort of concerted and collaborative effort. And some of the things that we've been doing that we can talk about are concerted, collaborative programmes with, for example, London councils, with the private sector, to really try and get this sort of push that we need across the country.
So before I ask other members to come in, I'm just aware that Susan from the G320s, I think you've got your hand up, is that right? And I did want to ask Adam, but can we stick to broad targets and numbers for the moment? Susan, would you like to?
I suppose just going to the other end of the scale, I run a very small housing association, and we've been doing quite a lot of work on this. Just in terms of cost, we're working to a target of getting all of our homes to EPCC by 2030. I think the government's currently consulting about bringing that date forward to 2028. And we currently, I think we've done EPCs almost across all of our stock just to establish our starting point. And we know that about 60% of our homes are going to need work to bring them up to even EPCC, which is a long way below net zero. And we've been working with some building energy efficiency specialists, and we've built into our business plan £25,000 per property on average to bring homes up to that target, which is just for our small organisation £7.5 million.
That's really useful as a again, just to bring that down to the grassroots level. And then Adam Harrison from Camden. I believe that Camden's done a broad estimate of the retrofitting needs of the borough. Is that right? And at a borough level, what are we talking about?
Thanks. In Camden, we have around 100,000 homes, about a third of which are...
I'm sorry, Adam, could you speak up a bit? I can hear
Yeah.
you said something about the number of homes, but I lost you after
Yeah,
that.
sure. So in Camden, we have around 100,000 homes. I hope that's okay. And around a third of which are directly owned and managed by the council. In terms of the work that we think we need to do to retrofit our own stock, depending on how far you go and how quickly the grid decarbonises, we think that could cost up to around £750 million. But we are also currently in the process of understanding how much it would cost to retrofit the entire stock within the borough. So that's still a work in progress, but it's looking more closer to the sort of £3 billion mark, and that's with quite a deep retrofit piece of work.
So that's just for the council-owned buildings. Does that include the leaseholds?
Yeah.
So that is £750 million
Yeah.
in one borough.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Adam. Right, I've got Ellie, I believe, wants to come in with some supplementary questions. Thank you.
Yes, if I can ask just, I know we're short on time, so I've just asked a couple of quick clarifications to Shirley, if that's okay. So just you've talked about the target dates a bit, but just to clarify, so the national target for net zero homes is 2050, but the Mayor has set the ambitious aim for London to be a zero carbon city by 2030. Can you confirm that the target date for homes is still, in London, is still 2050, and just briefly explain the difference between the targets?
There's a net zero carbon target that the government has set, 2050, and it's brought that forward in terms of, I think it's 78% emissions reductions by 2035. That comprises lots of different sectors, transport, housing, etc. Similarly, the Mayor has set a target for London to be a net zero carbon city by 2030. And again, within that, we have housing, transportation, workplaces, and so on. Housing is about a third of those emissions, and we want those emissions to be, all of our emissions to be net zero by 2030, but that's going to involve some level of offsetting, because you can't get to net zero completely, whether it's UK or London, because of things like shipping and aviation and so on. So there will be an element of offsetting, but within that we're trying to bring down all of those emissions to net zero as fast as possible.
Okay, thank you. And just also a clarification on EPCs. You mentioned that EPCs aren't necessarily the best measure. So the Mayor has said that building renovation passports could be a better measure. Can you explain what those are and why you believe they're better?
Yeah, lots of people are talking about them because they act as a sort of a logbook for your building, your house, or in fact any building. And it sets out in much more detail a whole host of issues about the building performance, not just the cost of running it, but its carbon performance. It can look at air pollution, the air quality of it. It also then tracks it acts as a way of logging any renovations that you may have done, so you can keep track of it. But also, crucially, what it does is sets out a sort of pathway to get to net zero. And gives you a way of then sort of ticking those off and recording that. It also acts as a way of building the market. So, it acts as a way for installers or financiers. So mortgage lenders can use it to assess the risks of the mortgage lending on it. You've got installers looking at, if you've got a quantum of these, you can understand what the market might be, and then that might lower costs. So it's really useful for a whole host of industries, but also a way of ramping up the retrofit, essentially, of a building. And then, of course, when you move or when you sell, that goes on to the next occupant, who can then, see what the history of the house is.
Very much. And Andrew Buff, you wanted to come in with some questions as well?
Just wanted to know whether or not the affordable housing programme that we've got at the moment is building those homes that are satisfactory in terms of climate change and our target for net zero.
I don't think any affordable housing programme across the country does that. I mean, Adam, maybe you can comment on it a bit more, but they're working to things like the Decent Home Standard, which I believe there's a consultation going on at the moment. That doesn't mandate, for example, net zero. It's not caught up with, for example, the sort of approach that we take to the London Plan in London. And those are the things I think that we would want to be reflected better, so that the whole country is building housing that's really fit for, for a whole host of things, but including helping to mitigate climate change and increasingly, being resilient to the impacts of climate change that we're seeing at the moment.
So new homes that are being built at the moment are not compliant and will have to be retrofitted?
No, new home, the London Plan homes,
yeah,
if they're being built according to the London plan, yes, but they also apply a decent home standard. So this is slightly out of my...
Sorry, I don't... Just be clear, you're saying if they're built to London plan standards, then they will be compliant?
They should be compliant. They will get as close to net zero as possible, but as I mentioned, that if they don't, there's an offset mechanism as well.
So you're quite confident that those homes, we won't have to revisit what's being built at the moment and then retrofit those?
No, I wouldn't say that, because I think every home is, because I've said there's a little bit that they can't quite get because of our technologies aren't quite there, or the development that we try to maximise as much as possible the energy efficiency and their contribution to net zero, but it's never quite 100%. So I think those homes are better than the ones that we have already, but they're not perfect, and they will at some point need to be retrofitted.
Why isn't this, bearing in mind the Mayor himself has declared a climate emergency, why aren't we attending to what we're building now?
Well, the Mayor is already building
yeah.
better standards than the government requires. So we have got standards in the London plan that go far beyond what the government is mandating, and we're securing, for example, carbon savings in the order of 41% more than building regulations already. We've been advocating to government to reinstate the zero carbon home standard that they abandoned several years ago and follow the London plan. If they did that, we'd be getting a much better carbon greenhouse gas emissions reduction performance than we're getting at the moment through government policy, and we'd really want to see that changed. This is a huge opportunity through the planning network, the planning frameworks, through what we do, as you said, through affordable housing, through our transport networks, to really take action on climate change.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still a little confused. So the new housing programme, that's the affordable housing programme from 2021-26, stuff that we're building there at some point we'll have to revisit. Is this what you're saying?
I'm saying that they are as zero carbon as we can get them. They're as close to zero carbon as they can get them if they are following the London plan. But all buildings, whether they're built in London or beyond, do not hit zero carbon exactly, because there are still things that they need to be done. So they will need to be
retrofitted. What are those things that need to be done? Is it needing more money, or the things that need to be done to make them zero carbon?
It's probably a combination of technologies. I don't know, James, if you know, you can jump in here and maybe help out.
Yeah, of course. What you're saying is absolutely right. I mean, sometimes it's not economically feasible or possible within delivery timescales for developers to achieve zero on site. And as Shelley said, what the Mayor's done is brought forward what would have been the zero carbon standard that that the UK government was going to introduce, I think, back in 2016, and then subsequently pulled. So effectively, we've gone well above and beyond what would have been the ambitious national target, but it is still sometimes uneconomic and unfeasible technically for some developers to achieve net zero on site. So therefore we have an offsetting mechanism, which means that the level of carbon emissions that they can't achieve on site then is monetized, and that money goes into local, for example, retrofitting schemes. So the aggregate is always the same amount of carbon that one would achieve if they could do it on site, but it's delivered elsewhere through other means.
Thank you.
I was going to try and bring you back from impinging on planning issues, but I think it is a good point. If there is going to be work to be done on new homes that then become existing homes in needs of work. We're moving on now to the next section, which is to question you in more detail, Shirley, about the Mayor's initiatives, and for that we have Deputy Chair of the committee. Congratulations to you two on that, Assemblymember Deputy.
Well, thank you, Chair. Good morning, Deputy Mayor. Could we turn to the Innovation Partnership, please? Could you start by saying what it is for the viewers on the webcast? What is the current status of the bidding process as well, please?
Okay, so I talked a little bit earlier about the approach that we're going to need in London and elsewhere really to really ramp up the efficiency of our homes and to really go into the deep house retrofit that we need now. So in the past we've done insulation measures which have been really about sort of glazing or a little bit of insulation, nothing really significant, and that's helped reduce carbon, but it's not the sort of order of magnitude that we need to reach net zero. And so this deep house retrofit is really taking a whole building approach, and it needs a lot more collaboration between those that have the problem, that own the problem in terms of whether it's owner occupiers or housing associations or local authorities who have the stock, or the companies, the building companies that can help come up with the solutions. And so there's been sort of quite a piecemeal approach across London. So what we decided to do in London was try and bring those actors together to really target a way of really ramping up the retrofit approach that we have in London. And so the innovation partnership was procured. We started in 2020, talking to people about how we might bring people together and what sort of approach might help facilitate boroughs, housing associations and those developers coming together to look at sort of 4 stages of deep retrofit. So things like assessing, for example, if you were to look at Camden, what is their housing stock, what sort of delivery plan would they need, what financing they might need as well, what do their residents want out of this deep retrofit, and what are their concerns, so that they can come up with a sort of plan for action. And then it would be working with a select number of builders off a framework to develop a prototype approach to that, and then thinking about how any technical problems might be solved. So these are sort of new approaches to deep retrofit. So you might have seen the initiative in the Netherlands called Energy Sprong, which is called Zero Carbon Homes, sort of energy leap. And because I've mentioned already the type of housing that we have, we'll need different approaches. So you're going to have different approaches in, for flats to flats in conservation areas to new builds and so on. So how do they all come together to prototype an approach, then test and refine it? And it's that point that you start to get the confidence then to scale up. And at that scale up will then bring the price down. And then you get that sort of commercialisation and delivery. And then all along through that, we're also building the supply side, sort of getting people to understand these are new approaches, so they need new skills. How do we build the supply side up? And that is part of a problem that we have already with the existing sort of retrofit approach that we're taking. In terms of where we are in the partnership, so we announced the partnership had been created earlier this year. We have 7 London-based housing providers who have, are agreeing to pilot part of their housing stock in this approach. And that's Lambeth, Ealing, Haringey, Barking and Dagenham, Sutton, Enfield and Hammersmith and Fulham. And then what we're just doing at the moment is just finalising the sort of long list of suppliers who will be working with them. So I can't name them just yet because we're just going through the final elements of the procurement process, which was an OG-based process. So anybody familiar with that knows that it takes some time to sign off and then get the legals all sorted out. But we've made great progress, and we're really looking forward to working with those boroughs and those developers to get started on that approach.
Clear, you're choosing 7 LAs for the first round, and then you appoint a bunch of contractors under those.
The 7 have said that they want to participate. So we've not appointed them. We just said so we'd love all 33 boroughs to participate. And actually, this isn't just a partnership. We're sort of starting with local authorities because we want to work with those who are really keen and to get this going. We then have a list of contractors who then the local authorities will select. But then because we've gone through the procurement process, they don't have to then go through a lengthy procurement process. They just match. We're essentially matchmaking the suppliers and the local authorities to come together.
And do you have a date by when that will be completed for the first stage?
The matching or
the appointment of the contractors so that you can get on with the work?
Soon, I think. James, I don't know if you've got any more updates, but I think we're just, as I said, the very final stages in the next few months, I'd have thought. Less, possibly.
Yes, possibly even earlier.
Okay. And how have you assessed the suitability of the firms selected, and have you looked at the social value as part of the tendering process?
So it's an OG process. So they go through contract evaluations, and James, maybe you can just jump in on the specifics.
Yeah.
But yes, they have all been assessed for example, some of the social value aspects, but along with financial due diligence, the normal procurement. But obviously what we want is the commitment to the net zero approach and innovation. James?
Yeah, well, because it's OG and because we're quite used to doing these types of OGs, we kind of ensure continuous improvement around them. So the suitability of firms is they're selected through quite rigorous, compliant sort of objectives. So on social value, that's all integrated in the process itself. So we've looked at objectives, KPIs, and outcomes around things like equality, diversity, inclusion. There's quite a lot in there about strategic labour needs, training, ethical resourcing is becoming hugely important. So, we expect that the evaluation, because we're going through the final stages now, will show that many of those suppliers have achieved those KPIs, those objectives, and will be able to deliver those outcomes, and those will be the ones that we appoint.
James, can you hear me? Sorry. Can you hear me, James?
Yes, I can hear you.
You and Shirley have both mentioned OG a couple of times. Can you just very briefly explain what that procurement process is, and also why we're still following it?
Would you like me to take that, Shirley?
Yeah, would you mind?
As briefly as you can, but the viewers may not be
very
understanding
quickly,
that.
over a certain level, which is about £180,000, if any public sector organisation is going to procure something, whether that be services or the delivery of a programme, they have to open it up to date to the whole of the European Union, and that's still the case. And that's to ensure that there's fair competition and that it's not in breach of things like state aid rules. Organisations will have their own threshold. So in the GLA, it's usually 150,000. So anything we procure over 150,000, we have to open it up to a very big, almost global market.
Thank you very much. Sorry, back to you, Assembly Member Debenham.
Going back to the Deputy Mayor, primarily because I think it is quite difficult on the video link, but thank you for James for trying. Going up a level back to where we were, the Mayor estimates that the Innovation Partnership could unlock a £10 billion market and 150,000 jobs. Senior politicians like to go back to big numbers. How are these figures derived at, please?
The 10 billion is the estimate of the potential if not just London local authorities, but local authorities outside of London participated in bringing forward the stock that they have. So, for example, we just heard from Susan and from Adam about the levels of funding that would be, or the sort of levels of estimate of stock and the cost of retrofitting that stock. So that's the sort of potential, and it's based on the sort of maintenance budgets that most local authorities have. So it's an average, and similarly on the homes and homes retrofitted, again, it's a sort of quantum that we've estimated, and I'm happy to send you a note afterwards with the detail.
Thank you. That's my next question, actually, so you've answered the next question. In terms of could you outline where the funding would come from for each of the retrofit under the partnership?
So it would come from either the local authority or the registered social landlord housing association through their maintenance budgets. Obviously, as we've said, these numbers are massive. So one of the things that we're talking about is how do we collectively look to encourage the private sector to start investing in this area. So one of the things that we've been working on is we've commissioned the Green Finance Institute to operate out the City of London to advise us on how do we come up with some financial mechanisms that would help encourage that flow of finance, whether it's from pension funds or from others, into the sort of retrofitting of not just homes but lots of infrastructure that we need for tackling climate change.
So none of the money comes from the £535 million that Mr Copley still has to allocate of his £5 billion housing monies?
I don't
that, to clarify, is the underspend in the current affordable housing grant programme.
For the first 5 years.
Have to ask. I'm happy to seek Tom Copley's, Deputy Mayor Copley's advice on that. I don't know anything about that underspend, I'm afraid.
Is there any money coming from the GLA at all to this funding?
Well, the funding that we put in through the spending of officer time, we put funding into creating this partnership. So just to be clear, the Mayor doesn't have or control housing stock. So our job and what we see as our key role is how do we facilitate those that do, housing associations, local authorities and the private sector, to come together and look at the challenges and the barriers. So one of the challenges has been the sort of procurement approach. The other challenge is finance. The other challenge is how do you prototype these new approaches, which is why initiatives like the Innovation Partnership are going to help with that.
Okay. The Retrofit Accelerator for homes.
Sorry, yeah, could I just come in there?
I was going to bring you in after, but is that, should we move on? Should we?
I'm very happy to come back after AM Cooper.
Well, it was kind of following on really from that point about, good morning, Shirley.
Hi.
Putting money in and making things continue. So it was about the National Centre for Retrofit Excellence, which I actually asked the Mayor about in Mayor's question time. And I know there's money from, I think it's Bayes, 3.45 million to get that up and running. How will the project continue its work, which obviously is really important in terms of guiding social housing providers through the retrofit process so that they can hopefully maximise the amount of money that they can claim. But what's going to happen when that 3.45 million comes to an end? How's it going to continue?
Well, at the moment, it's a sort of proof of concept. So, we have, through the team, done some excellent work in using our accelerators to help local authorities bid and secure funding from the government programmes. I think in the order of about 180 million now, and James can possibly talk about that a bit later about, how we've done that. But the approach that we've taken and the quality of the retrofits that we've been doing in London and the sort of innovation is something that the government have decided that, really is something that we want to replicate across, not just across London, but across the country. So that Centre of Excellence and indeed the Innovation Partnership is not confined just to London boroughs because of the work that James and his team and our contractors have been doing, really sort of good quality work. So I think we want to show that this is successful, and I think we will do, and on the basis of that, because this has to be an ongoing programme. So this is one of the questions that we've been asking government about, is about the approach that we're taking, that the scale of the challenge we have means that we need to have long-term certainty and clarity about policy frameworks, but also funding. And so I think, what we'd be seeking is more government support for that Centre of Excellence to keep helping local authorities access the funding programmes they have, and also come up with sort of new mechanisms, as we said, for financing them through the private sector.
Yes, I think we're very keen to see that as a committee, because obviously we're aware that, you were talking about the quantum being 61 billion mostly on housings, which I think is why we're digging into these questions about how are these things going to continue. But I'll pass back to Assemblymember Devonish now. Thank you.
Thank you. The Retrofit Accelerator for homes aims to have 1,678 homes either fully retrofitted or in the process of being retrofitted or in contract to be retrofitted by August 2022. Could you please provide us with an update on the progress, or if you need to, you can write to us?
I could, unless James, you can jump in there, but we can certainly write to you afterwards. And if you want to know now, I know that there has been some good work and it's sort of on track for meeting those targets.
I'm sure a more detailed response will be in writing, will be fine.
Okay.
Can I just, Chair, I have one supplementary question and then I'll pass on to colleagues. In terms of the sense of urgency of these programmes, if you talk to the previous Mayor's administration, between 2009 and 16, the previous Mayor's groundbreaking new homes retrofit programme delivered energy efficiency improvements to over 130,000 homes. The current Mayor's Retrofit Accelerator programme proposes to retrofit just the 1,600 I just mentioned by August 22. Do you think that's a reason we could be defined as a lack of ambition, and how will you accelerate much, much quicker?
No, I wouldn't, because I think, as I mentioned before, the number of homes that need to be retrofitted is massive, but what we need to do is a completely different approach to what was taken in the past. So whilst it was appropriate at the time to start looking at insulation and retrofitting, it's not sufficient. You know, we have to do the deep house, the whole house retrofit. And that's why these numbers that we're talking about are very different, because this is really a new approach. You know, the sort of Energy Leap, Energy Sprong pilot that we're also doing now is requiring a different way of working from local authorities to the builders to financiers. So those smaller numbers are really proof of concepts that we then need to demonstrate that can be done across London. We've already, you know, we've come to the close of one programme that's showing it is work, and on the basis of that we've got these extra numbers that we're rolling out and the funding that we have from government. Once those are proven, and through the innovation partnership, we then start to see the acceleration and scale up to the, you know, more than the 130,000 homes that were done in that previous administration. The order of homes that we're talking about is massive, you know, 160,000 homes a year. Nobody is doing that level of retrofit across the country at all, partly because we don't have the policy and funding or the supply chain yet, or indeed you know, whilst we know what needs to happen and we've got some approaches in London that we know could work, it's getting that scale up, that's what that approach is what we're looking at now.
Thank you. And just finally, you said that the previous mayor had just basically done insulation in homes. Can you be a bit clearer in terms of what is the step change you're actually doing? If he did insulation, what are you actually doing?
So the difference is the sort of basic insulation that would have happened before, some double glazing or possibly triple glazing. Now what we're looking at is things like really looking at fabric insulation, so the walls, not just a little bit of insulation here and there. We're looking at renewable energy going in, new energy systems, you know, like heat pumps, which would then bring down, bring down the energy usage and make sure that the energy used is renewable. As I've said, we're also looking at ventilation issues, because when you're looking at energy efficiency, you still have to make sure that the home is well ventilated and to support people's health. So these are much more expensive and much more costly approaches. You know, things like heat pumps, not really trialled at scale in this country. So those are a much more expensive kit, basically, that we're having to look at.
And finally, as the Climate Change Committee said it with their 2050 target to require the decarbonisation of the entire housing stock in the UK, do you think in less than 30 years you're going to be able to do that in London?
I think we can if we have the policy, as I said, the policy and the funding, but also, but that means everyone. That means looking at the supply chain. So we already have a problem in London and actually the country with the funding that the government has given. So everybody's now looking at retrofitting, but that means the supply chain that was there is not able to keep up with the demands that we're all putting on it. So to ramp up to the levels that the government wants, let alone what this or other mayors wants, needs a massive change and uplift in the supply chain. And this is a sort of the story about this retrofit revolution is really, this is new jobs, good quality, clean jobs that would really help with the whole host of issues that we're dealing with in terms of the economic and social impacts of the pandemic, but also the sort of Green New Deal approach is precisely about how do we get people out the jobs that are polluting into better, cleaner jobs. And that supply chain, we're doing some work through working with Jules Pipe and others on an extension of the Construction Academy approach that we've taken to support those green skills and to start to support those green skills and use that as a sort of template for government to roll out across the country.
I'll leave it there, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And if I just add one more question, it sort of follows on from that, really. You talk about needing a complete step change in the industry. And I worry, we've seen a partnership approach like this before in housing, and it's always tended to favour existing large firms. And if you need to have a whole new approach and new companies coming through to do this work, is the big OG process that favours large companies doing big partnerships across 7 boroughs, is that approach going to mitigate against maybe what are smaller firms now, but ought to be the bigger firms of the future? Isn't it going to entrench the industry using that kind of approach?
I can see that's a risk, but I think, you know, and James can talk about this a bit more, but, you know, we'd expect their supply chain is smaller firms. You know, it's a bit like, you know, the Mayor's procurement of buses. You know, when he went up to Yorkshire, you know, there are big bus companies there, but their supply chain is even further around the rest of the country, and those are the small firms that would then benefit from this approach. So through our procurement approaches, we're seeking to make sure that the supply chains are also all attuned and aligned to the net zero ambition. So we would expect the major suppliers to be looking at as well. But I think, you know, it's something that I think we want to make sure that as we're looking at, for example, the skills approach, that those smaller companies also get access to those so that they can compete in those bigger markets as well. So it's a good point,
Okay,
Charles.
just not with your chosen partnership firms.
I don't know, because I don't know who they are, and we're not allowed to say who they are. But James, I don't know if you can say how smaller firms are going to be looked at.
Yeah, there is actually a large parallel sort of set of activity happening as the procurement progresses. We need to create a supply chain that has large and small players who all deliver quality retrofit solutions. You know, skilled installers are really in short supply at the moment, especially accredited ones. So in parallel with the procurement, we've been engaging with a whole range of small to medium-sized local firms who would, in the future, hopefully be able to subcontract with the larger firms that we're procuring. So the idea is being able to sort of create a web of support. And this has happened over the last couple of months, but it's included kind of supply chain research, engagement, including, I think, contacting about 60 to 70 individual companies. We've had about 30 or 40 meetings to try to sort of facilitate introductions. And we plan to do and share a lot of case studies to facilitate sort of networking once the bigger firms are actually procured.
Okay,
and
sorry,
identify how they can link together.
Thank you very much. Sorry to move you on. We've got one more set of questions coming from Assemblymember Cooper before you go, Shirley, so hopefully you can stay till.
Yeah, I doubt that we're going to be able to get through them because we've got so little time left, but let's see how we get on. The Mayor's manifesto said that he was going to be lobbying government for funds for retrofitting homes in London. How much money is the Mayor going to be seeking? I presume he's not expecting a budget of 61 billion beyond the current rather paltry level of government funding that's currently available. And I think that it was delayed, and there's been 60 million on the table from a retrofit programme. How much of that have we managed to get hold of?
So the government hasn't set out completely its plans for funding, and we're obviously developing our case for the comprehensive spending review that will be coming up later this year. But of the money that has been released, you know, what we're trying to make sure is that we access, you know, London's proportionate share of that, whether it's the government funding programs they have or the the energy company supply obligation as well. So in terms of the funding that we have managed to secure, it's not too far out of being in line with a sort of proportionate share at the moment. But in terms of the scale of need that we talked about, that's not going to, you know, we're going to need that ramped up. And as I've said, that can't just come from local authorities, but it has to come from the private sector as well as government grants. So we would hope that the government's commitment of a £9 billion fund was at least kept, but I think we need much more than that, as we've seen the huge numbers that that Susan and Adam and I have been talking about. So how do we need more of that? And in terms of eco funding, we don't get our fair share. So we've been lobbying very hard to get a greater share. I think we get probably about 40 or 50% of what Londoners spend in terms of their fuel bills, and the sort of eco obligation on that coming back to London. We'd like to have 100%. Of that.
Yeah, I mean, that's been an ongoing problem for ages, mainly because the energy companies find it so much easier to work in places where there aren't controlled parking zones or all the other expenses associated with trying to deliver programmes in London. Could I just move on to the issues around mandatory minimum energy efficiency standards, which is obviously is a huge issue in the private sector. The Environment Committee, as I'm sure you're aware, suggested that the government should increase the cap for landlord contributions to those measures from 3,500 to 5,000, because obviously a lot of landlords do make a lot of money, particularly in London, from renting out. So 5,000 seems a sort of fairly insignificant figure. What discussions have been had with government about this, and how important is it that we achieve this for those who are privately renting in London particularly?
It's hugely important, and I think we also supported that higher level of cap as well. So we've been raising this with government in sort of various consultation responses. They have got a new consultation out where they're talking about raising the level up to £10,000, which I think would be a much better reflection of certainly the costs to landlords and the costs in London. So we would hope, we're advocating that is being picked up because, it would have such a big impact on fuel poverty and on carbon emissions as well.
I mean, I presume that the Mayor will be supporting the raising of the cap to 10k. Actually, it seems a bit odd to have refused to raise it from 3.5 to 5 and then suddenly to jump to 10. I would personally have preferred it to have stepped up, but maybe that's something, Chair, we can consider writing to MHCLG and supporting, because it seems like a really important area. Just moving on, I mean, the Green Homes Grant Scheme, you were talking about eco, and we only got a small fraction of the share that we should have had from the energy companies of that. The Green Homes Grant Scheme doesn't really seem to have been much of its success in London. I understand that there were only 1,699 grants given out, 2 in Westminster being the lowest, and 141 in Newham being about the highest. I mean, what went wrong with the scheme, and is there anything that we can learn that would allow schemes to work better? That seems a complete failure.
It was a very complicated scheme to operate. I think there weren't enough suppliers for it, and as you've alluded to, where it's easier and cheaper to operate, that's where suppliers will go. And so it's complicated to work in London and big cities, so that's why. I mean, I tried to have a look at it as well, and it was very complicated to find somebody. I think there were also difficulties for suppliers in registering and trying to access the databases, to be on the supply list. And I think one of the big lessons, I think, is allowing these schemes time to bed in. So it wasn't great, but the scheme was pulled before it could really bed in, and the changes that we and the industry were asking for to be incorporated could have been incorporated. And I think that stop-start approach is what causes problems for installers, and it also puts householders off, because those who might be interested then just get put off for another few years and thinking, well, it's not worth the bother. So I think what we want is a scheme that's really simple to use, that really is user friendly, that allows the installers, accredited, good high quality accredited installers, to sign up, and then lots of them across London, and maybe a premium so for working in a city, so that people don't, that those in cities aren't disadvantaged, and people
I think some
favour
very wise points there, because we went through all of that with the feed-in tariff, and lots of people going through MCS accreditation and then all going bust when the scheme was massively downgraded and destroyed, really. Can I just ask you about the Decent Homes Standard? My understanding is there's a review going on. Obviously, it played its role in the early 2000s, and because of thermal comfort and everyone fitting TRVs on radiators and all that sort of thing, I think it has had some impact indeed on fuel poverty as well. In terms of the decarbonisation and improving energy efficiency of social homes, what changes would you like to see in the Decent Home Standard as part of the review? And will you be submitting something, I presume, to government to? Yeah,
definitely. But I think to keep it simple, it would be to mandate a sort of a net zero approach, but also one that takes into account climate adaptation too, because the homes have to be resilient, but also maximise their energy efficiency as far as possible, so it can contribute to the net zero target.
Right, so improving the section on weatherproofing, for example, to really move towards mitigation and adaptation as well. Yeah, that seems like a good place to go. The government was planning to publish a heat and building strategy. which was going to set out its approach to reducing emissions from buildings. I think that was due last year. They seem to have been distracted by, I don't know, there was something going on last year, I've heard. Now it's been delayed. It may also have been delayed because of some cabinet arguments over how to, what funding could be associated with this new strategy. It's difficult for us in the absence of that strategy to go ahead. But what plans should we be making in London in terms of retrofitting? Otherwise, we've got no chance of hitting the zero carbon by 2050 target that the Mayor is keen for us to achieve, have we? What can we do?
I think we're doing what we can, and the approach that we're doing at the moment, the innovation partnership, the move to deep and whole house retrofits is exactly what is going to be needed. So we know that the government are going to have to come in line with this because there isn't really another way of meeting those targets. So our approach of piloting and doing the proof of concepts, really, getting people aligned behind this. So it's brilliant to see those 7 boroughs and to see so much interest from the private sector building companies around this. And we've seen lots of reports from the industry. I think the construction industry recently was asking government to come out with that strategy and the other net zero strategies so that they can start to really have that certainty of planning. And so on. So we know there are no regrets. These are things we're going to have to do. So we're just getting on with what we can do in London. These might be small numbers, but without doing those small numbers proof of concept, you can't get to the big numbers that are needed in London.
No, otherwise we go around in that constant circle of proving, that passive house works, or the code for sustainable homes is a good thing, destroying them and then having to reprove everything. Have I got time just to ask you a little bit about fuel poverty?
Yes,
Thank you. I'm just conscious that we're very close on the clock. The updated February 2021 fuel poverty strategy confirmed a new fuel poverty metric, the low income, low energy efficiency, which I've no doubt is going to be called Lily by all of its friends and possibly by some of its enemies. It, of course, showed that London has the highest proportion of fuel poverty households by region at 16.7%. I think we can probably work out what the factors are that have led Londoners to be sort of overrepresented in this, but specifically, what would you point the finger at?
Well, it's a combination of poorly insulated homes, which means high energy costs, incomes, very low level of incomes, and high costs in London. So that all leads to fuel poverty. And then if you're looking then to get energy, the energy prices are high, and we're seeing really volatile prices at the moment. So prices are going up. So that sort of combination of issues. Which the Mayor has addressed in his fuel poverty action plan, sort of set those out, and the sorts of things that we're doing, like warmer homes, like the Warmer Homes Advice Service, that we are funding local authorities to provide advice on income maximisation, but on how they might access, for example, some of the programmes that we in local authorities have in terms of retrofitting homes, but also how they might reduce their bills and so on. So those are the sorts of things that we can help with and help facilitate local authorities with. But obviously the bigger issue of sort of benefits changes, raising people's incomes is a big key issue.
Potentially indirectly, some of the community energy groups that the Mayor has assisted with moving ahead with their plans, they also use some of the surplus that they've made to recycle it into offering energy advice workshops. Certainly to my knowledge, that's what Chelsea has been doing, and that Crew has been doing a lot, so talking about South East and South West London. I'm less familiar with North London. I believe there's other people in the room who can talk about North London instead. You mentioned eco earlier. Now that seems to me to be a really good way of targeting some of these houses where we have got people who are living, who might be making those choices between eating and heating and who really are fuel poor. I believe the Mayor has said that fair funding would mean that London should get at least 130 million. I mean, this seems to me to be a typical example of something where the government's levelling up agenda should come into play. Are we actually going to get a fair level of funding from ECO for fuel poor Londoners, do you think?
I hope so. I mean, we've certainly tried to facilitate accessing more of ECO by putting in place a scheme that operates London-wide, which has meant that more people fall into that definition of eco, who would have fallen out of it. So that's increased the number who are accessing it, and I think that's partly helped for our numbers going up, but it's not sufficient. So I think what we're going to do is look at the criteria and see if we can align more, but I think it also requires the lobbying of government and, to change the regulations so that, some of that money can come back to support those people in fuel poverty.
Finally, can I just ask you about EPC ratings, which we've discussed a bit. Now, a lot of people have been talking about reaching EPC C, which of course is a band. So as far as I understand, what people are talking about is reaching SAP 69, which is the bottom of EPC C. But I believe the Mayor has said that the 2030 target should be to reach band B, EPC B. Now, A and B are fairly easy to achieve for new builds that have got sort of really good insulation and all the rest of it. But for a lot of London's housing stock, which is Edwardian and Victorian, solid wall, people might have put loft insulation in, but, they can't inject stuff into the walls. It's pretty hard to improve the insulation. Is it actually possible for us to get London's housing stock to band B by 2030? I'm seriously worried that we just can't.
I think the aspiration is to get those houses that can get to B to and as high up as possible, as we can. But I think there are going to be homes that we're just not going to be able to do precisely for those reasons. So again, it's how do we maximise those? Many of those are on EFG, in this day and age. So how do we even get them to be as high or as close to B as possible? And then it's about what else we might be able to do to help. That's not going to solve fuel poverty in of itself. We need to be looking at incomes and so on as well.
I think we are talking about either external or internal wall insulation, and EWI or IWI is pretty disruptive for most people, and I'm very conscious that I can see our friend from Barnsley Homes is nodding on that one. You may have suspected, and in fact I do have a background of working in housing associations, and so I would imagine you must have been looking at all of these in detail in Barnsley.
But I think, with new technologies and the whole house approach, and again, maybe James can go in that a bit better, then, I think we've got a better chance now of getting more houses up to EPCB, but I would imagine there would still be a proportion of the stock that wouldn't. But we've got to maximise their energy efficiency as much as we can do.
I think some of the new materials that, the polymers that now can create much thinner surfaces are now becoming much more practical. But I think at one point when people were talking about internal wall insulation that was incredibly thick, and you'd have to rehang every door, and you'd lose inches of people's rooms, so they'd probably have to lose half of their furniture. I don't think that was ever going to happen. But maybe now you think we're moving faster towards that in terms of the technologies?
I think the technologies are getting better. I couldn't comment on that specific issue, but I think there is a point that you've just raised there is about people's acceptability of these changes. These are big disruptions and so on. But the approach that we're taking through the work we're doing is precisely about how do you bring people along with you? What are their concerns, and what would remedy those concerns? Because we need to act on this, and I think using that information and that evidence and that learning is really going to help not just London but the rest of the country too.
Yes, I think that's possibly an area that is a very strong area for the GLA to be involved in, is working out the how to bring people with in terms of that sort of behaviour change and happiness with change, given that the GLA is not actually a direct landlord owning organisation. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Assemblymember Cooper, and thank you very much, Deputy Mayor Shirley Roderick-Regas. You can go now. I wonder if we've got a moment, Assemblymember Cooper, to just ask James a couple more follow-ups to clarify those on some of those issues you were.
I am quite interested in the idea of trying to get to Band B, and I also wonder whether Susan might want to come in on that, because she was really. It looked as though she was very engaged on that area, and I just know that it is so difficult.
So if you want to hold the floor and just wrap that up a little bit more, that's fine.
Yeah, that would be great. James, I don't know whether you want to come in first on achieving Band B by 2030.
Yeah, I could say a couple of factual things that we've learned through our evidence gathering. Shirley noted earlier that we have a London building stock model that took us over 2.5 years to build with UCL. What that's showed so far is that we know that there are physical limitations to London's buildings. So, for example, we know that the majority of buildings within about F and G are the worst rating, are within the owner-occupied sector, where we know there are no regulatory drivers. Okay, so MESIP for the applied to the private rented sector. So that is a challenge. We also know that about a fifth of all of our buildings will not achieve a B or a C. So this points to what Shirley said earlier about actually having some that are climate positive. That is, they help pick up the slack of some of the others. And just going back on the question around fuel poverty, the Mayor's Fuel Poverty Action Plan showed that there were no fuel poor homes in London with a rating of an A or a B. This was as at, I think, 2017. But about 1,700 homes with a rating of around C. So at times that was less than 0.5% of London's fuel poor homes, and we know the number of fuel poor homes has gone up. London currently have about 530,000. So I think this gives you an idea of the orders of magnitude that we're talking about here. What we are trying to do through the Mayor's programmes is effectively try to prioritise a lot of the renewable installations that we want to make in London through the Mayor's Warmer Homes programme by giving quite large grants, piggybacking on the local area delivery funding that we have managed to secure. We've managed to secure about 30 million so far for the next year, just to focus through the Warmer Homes programme. And that will be principally about trying to bring those homes to a higher EPC and install renewables, solar panels, and increase the thermal efficiency of those homes.
Okay, that's interesting. So would you be looking to give those grants into the private sector then mainly, if that's where the bulk of those E, F or G rated properties are?
So quite. So over the last couple of years, when we started Warmer Homes, and forgive me, I think it was 2018, it started with owner-occupier fuel poor homes. We then trialled the private rented sector. The committee will be aware of some of the real challenges around, leaseholders and tenants and getting approval through landlords and so on. So we trialled and we created a system where that actually worked quite successfully. Now the Warmer Homes programme operates for all of the private rented sector as well as the owner-occupied sector. So we will be trying to maximise what we can do there, given that they're the worst offenders, if you like, when it comes to the most inefficient homes.
Yes, I guess my concern is about if the grants are mainly going towards the homeowner rather than towards the private rented sector, Chair. And I just wonder whether this is something that we should be corresponding with the Mayor on in terms of where that budget is going to, because I think there's a lot of people who are in dire circumstances in the private rented sector. Thank you.
With you more. Sorry, just for time, we're going to have to
understand.
Move on. We'll come back to housing associations later on, and we are now just going to finish off talking to some of our other guests about the government initiatives and the funding that we were talking about then, having talked a little bit about the technicalities there. If Assemblymember Clark.
Thank you, Chair. I should have mentioned earlier, I don't know if it is related to declarable interest, but obviously my constituency is Barnet and Camden, and Councillor Harrison serves a Camden ward, as do you, which I don't normally declare.
That's definitely not a conflict with your job, given it's your job.
No,
so
but
that's fine.
It felt wrong not to say anything at all. Anyway, my first question is for you, Bradley. Do you feel we have a clear picture on what government funding for retrofit will look like going forward? Is there any sense that London may receive less as the government seeks to level up other areas and EU funding is replaced with a shared prosperity fund?
Thank you for your question. On the issue of sort of funding from a government level, what we have said in our policy paper that we published last year, Retrofitting to Decarbonise, was that we really do need to see government prioritising retrofitting as a national infrastructure priority, and we really need a policy roadmap for the current schemes that are currently out there in terms of climate, energy and fuel poverty policies, and how that roadmap will get us to the targets for 2030 and beyond. So I do think that that's something that needs to be looked at the central government level. In terms of whether London will potentially receive less, I don't think I could probably comment on that, but I know that looking at some of the schemes that we were talking about earlier from the London perspective, I know that at least one of them was at least partly funded by the European Regional Development Fund, and obviously we can't rely on funding like that anymore, given that we're no longer in the European Union. So those are things that we'll have to consider. Thank you.
The next question is open to anyone who'd like to answer it. And Susan, I don't feel we've heard enough from you, actually. So let me pick on you. Are government initiatives such as the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund and the Local Authority Delivery Scheme operating effectively?
Well, I think it's in early stages. So in terms of my organisation, we managed to get a very small number of green homes grants last year. As somebody else said, it's a really complex process. It was a 20-step process to go through. When you looked at the sort of procedures that were involved, I think even though less than half of our homes are C and above, there was a really small percentage that actually qualified for the grant, and then there was an income cap as well on the tenants who lived there. So, in fact, I think we got 2 or 3 of the Green Homes grants. So, we were very happy to work. We worked well with the local authority, but actually, it was, in terms of the effort involved in securing the grant for the output, the impact was relatively limited. I think. There's a lot of work going on in Bays, I think, at the minute about designing the Decarbonisation Fund, and I think I suppose the questions for us are about the level of funding. I think the certainty of funding. I think one of the things that is a particular issue for small housing associations at the minute is that bidding timescales for these funds tend to be quite short, and if you don't have teams of people with ready to go schemes, it's actually really difficult to produce schemes and then bid and then deliver within what are quite short timescales. So I think what we would like to see is funding programs with sort of 3 to 5 year time horizons, so that we can look at our normal stock investment plan and say, this is what we're going to spend, these are the schemes, these are the interventions we're going to make over the next 3 to 5 years. How can we apply for funding? We know that the funding is going to be there to support that work that's going on. So I think from my knowledge, I think Bays is listening to those concerns, but it feels like there's a little way to go before we get a scheme that's that's working properly for all housing associations.
And do you think anything about that scheme is working particularly well? It sounds like there's a number of challenges.
I think. I mean, I'm part of a couple of National Housing Federation groups that are talking to Bays, and I think there's a real willingness to listen to how can we design these schemes to make it work. But the output haven't yet. I think it hasn't got to the point where the outputs are there. We don't know exactly what the scheme's going to look like.
Okay. Did anyone else want to add to that?
I would just say that in relation to funding, I think it's really important that any funding schemes are consistent and affordable, and that they're in place for a number of years. There's been a myriad of different schemes at government level over several years, some which have been more successful than others. So I think that's something that needs to be considered.
James, I have another question for you. The GLA is leading a consortia of London boroughs which have secured funding via the Green Homes Grant Local Authority Delivery Scheme. Can you tell us what projects you are delivering under the scheme?
Bradley, sorry.
What's that?
You said James.
I did say James.
James, yeah.
That's a GLA question.
Is he listening?
Yep, sorry, I thought it was directed at someone else until I heard the question. More than happy to answer that. So I think you're asking about the projects that we have secured funding for via the local authority delivery scheme. So we've secured so far just under 10 million through what is the Greater South East Energy Hub. So the GLA secured around 10 million, and we've got a further, I think it's about 18.7 million through the hub. What we're going to try to do with that is improve about 3,000 homes across London of all tenures, and these will be operating through the Warmer Homes programme. And we've also been successful in securing funding through the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund as well.
Okay. Also,
Sorry, can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Can I come in at that point? Because I think James has just outlined that in the first round we got 10 million, in the second round 18, is that right? And that's 10 million out of 74 million for the whole country.
We
That doesn't seem proportional.
9.45 million exactly for the GLA to fund the Warmer Homes programme, over and above what the GLA was funding anyway, which is over 2 million. We are then bid as a consortia through, so there's hub bidding, you'll probably know, and there's many hubs across the country. So for the southeast, it involves London and some of the areas around it. And there's an allocation for that hub, of which about 19 million will be directed through the Mayor's Warmer Homes programme.
No, so my question is only, sorry, rather than go through all the numbers again, as a proportion of what we're getting in London compared with the rest of the country, is it right? Is that about right, considering how many homes we have? It sounds not.
No, as Shirley said, this is actually very good. So we've long lobbied for our fair share of funding. So far, we've secured more or less our fair share of funding.
Okay.
To get our fair share in total, it would be more like 50 million. But compared to historical levels, this is quite good.
So it's not proportional, but it's a bit better than it used to be. Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Just
we have
wanted to
other
get that
bids in
clarity.
train as well. So you'll probably know that the local authority delivery and the social housing decarbonisation fund, there's lots of different ways of it. And we are moving through that process with government. So we are securing money at every single stage.
Okay, sorry, just wanted to do some maths for a second there.
Absolutely fine. Should I ask question 12 now? Yeah, okay, back to Bradley again. It is not intended that the public sector will entirely fund decarbonisation, and some funding will have to come from the private sector. Do you think there is a clear path forward on how to make this transition, and is enough being done to stimulate the market to take on a degree of self-sufficiency?
Not at this stage, I don't think so. I think what was said earlier by the Deputy Mayor about the role of the private sector, when you think about the level of investment that's going to be needed and the level of skills, the pipeline of skills that will have to come through, then yes, I think private sector involvement will be necessary, but I don't think government can rely on that at this stage, and I'm sure we'll go on to it later in the session, but there really is the skills gap at the moment. Skills and funding, I would say, are the two biggest challenges in the retrofitting area. And until we have significant progress on those, it will be very difficult to meet the substantial targets in the retrofitting of existing housing stock.
Okay, thank you. And finally, to Adam, do you think the government is giving enough political leadership on this issue? And are they giving you and your residents certainty over what needs to be done over the next 30 years?
Thanks. I think on that kind of your second question there, I think, as other speakers have already said, I think what is most required is certainty in terms of funding and government intentions to support the expenditure that we're going to have to give out over the next few years. This isn't just in terms of local authorities being able to plan and be able to plan ahead for what we're going to do with our own stock, which is a process we're currently actively going through within Camden to understand our stock and plan ahead for the next few years. But it's clear that from our teams talking to contractors and potential providers that things like the abolition of the Green Homes Grant for private homeowners within the last year and other stop-start schemes that we've seen over the years really has harmed confidence among the contractors who we need to be investing in their own workforce, who need to be gaining the quality accreditations that are needed. They've been really, I think, shaken by that. To try to remedy that, we are working with other councils, we're working with the GLA to think about what role we can play in terms of kind of improving that skills pipeline, working with local further education colleges and so on. But I think perhaps there has been an underestimation of the impact of that uncertainty in the private sector retrofit space. It's actually good that there is some certainty in the social housing space in the form of the social housing decarbonisation fund and other streams that are coming forward, because that will give the confidence to ourselves and to others that there is some funding coming forward. It is worth investing. It is worth creating these jobs. But actually, it would be stronger if we had as London, we had two wings to fly, so that all sectors were powering forward, and that we were able to ensure we are able to deliver when this funding comes forward. And at the moment, there's still that huge uncertainty about whether we have the people who could actually undertake the retrofit. And there is a lot of talk all the time about Green New Deal, green jobs revolution, but now is the time to establish that certainty. And it's interesting hearing Susan's remarks about bays. I think there is willingness. I wouldn't be a total critic of the government on this, but actually we need to move more quickly.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think Assemblymember Dumblish has a quick follow-up question.
Very quickly, back to Susan. You mentioned 20 steps, the complexity of actually getting this money. Could you send us do you have a flow chart from one of these OJUs that you could send us? I think it's just a good point that how complex it is. And do you have that?
I have to talk to the local authority we work with, because it's essentially their process, but it's the process we had to go through.
Yeah. And then maybe I can put that question to James. James, do you think there's any way we could simplify down I know this is partly a government procurement, but it's also a GLA one. Can we simplify these processes down so people don't lose the will to live when they're bidding for this?
When we're bidding for money from governments, I think absolutely. I think the government's already learning by doing, in that is the first two tranches of the local authority delivery fund actually went directly to authorities, where the money that's come for boroughs, come through the hub, which eventually will go to boroughs, has been much more complicated. And I think they've already seen that it's been complicated, and now they're reverting back to their initial way of doing things for the third tranche. I think what people have said is absolutely right. They need to have a lot longer delivery time. I think government feels that you can do retrofit almost instantaneously, and we shouldn't forget that a lot of this funding was launched during lockdown, and that was when many sites weren't in operation. That was when many organisations weren't fully functioning, and when homes weren't accessible. So as a result, that's kind of really squeezed the timelines, and that's also put pressure on the supply chain as well, which we know is fledgling.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Right, so we have our final section. We're running a tiny bit behind. Apologies. This is the minutes add up. This is my first time chairing for a while. So hopefully you can all stay another 10 minutes or so. The next section is about just the challenges, more practical challenges as well. And we've got Assembly Member Baker who's going to ask those questions.
Thanks, Chair. So I think we've all sort of strayed into it. So maybe I might be revisiting things that we've talked about a bit, but that might gain a bit of time back. But firstly, so Susan, what has been the experience with retrofit as Barnsbury Housing Association?
Well, I suppose first of all I would say we're right at the start of our journey on this. Our board made a decision about 18 months ago that because we know that about a third of our tenants really struggle to pay their fuel bills, that this should be a priority for us. And on a personal level, I've done a lot of work over the last 18 months to get us to the start of this. And I know from other colleagues on the G320, there's a huge willingness and appetite for retrofit, but a lot of organisations were really kind of on the starting blocks. So I would say, in terms of our experience, it isn't typical, but I think others will be, going down the same path that we've gone down over the next sort of year or two. So just in terms of sort of what we've done, we're, as I say, we're very small. We've got 300 homes. One of the challenges we've got is about a third of our homes are listed buildings. And almost all of our homes are in conservation areas, so that adds another kind of layer of complexity to it. So we started off by establishing our baseline and getting EPCs right across our stock. I think we had about 25% before, and we've been working with some specialists to model each one of our buildings and work out what we need to do to get it to a good standard, and that standard won't be net zero. It's just not going to be possible on many of the buildings that we own. And we're working with some specialist architects and, as I say, energy consultants on a pilot project in Barnsbury Street, which is some of the first properties we ever bought back in the 1960s. And it's quite a painful process, to be honest. So we are having conversations about the sort of measures that we can put in there. We think it's probably, for that particular retrofit, we think it's a one-bedroom flat in a Grade 2 listed building, about £30,000 we're going to invest. I was having conversations just yesterday about internal wall insulation, what's going to be possible, what are we going to be able to do to the windows. It's quite difficult, and we're trying to come up with a mechanism for working out, sort of trying to balance cost, disruption, the carbon impact we'll have, the impact on sap rating, and make a judgment. How do we make the right judgment about what's the right interventions in each property? And a particular challenge, I think, is around planning and how heritage buildings are treated. And I think, a dialogue will have to be started at some point with planning about standards, and where the compromises might have to be in heritage properties in terms of improving energy efficiency. We obviously can't do, and would never want to do, external wall insulation on listed buildings, but what can we do on the inside of the building? Looking at windows, even double glazed replacement panels in the existing windows aren't acceptable. So there's always going to be weak points in those buildings. So they're the sort of challenges that very practical challenges that we're dealing with at the moment.
That's really helpful, thank you. And just very specifically on what you were saying, obviously you're talking about fuel bills and the disruption to tenants. How do you manage that? How do you engage with your tenants on that?
Well, again, I would say we're at the start of that. So, we've started to have conversations with our residents panel and with residents generally, and people are really receptive and they understand the challenge. I think it really bumps up against reality when, you're sort of trying to plan a deep retrofit in a property. We're taking the easy route and doing it in an empty property at the minute, but actually if you're doing internal wall insulation, a lot of our properties have got lovely cornicings, they've got shutter boxes, that's where the difficult conversations have to happen with residents around what's possible, what can we do with you living there, are we going to have to move people out of properties while the work's done, and I'd say we're just at the start of those conversations. I think there's a really interesting piece of work being done recently by the Tenant Participation Advisory Service around what sort of tenants of social housing are saying about retrofitting and about the challenge, and some really interesting findings around the use of language around fuel poverty, and that's something that people don't want to think that they're poor. So the language we're starting to use is about livability and comfort in properties, rather than using language around fuel poverty. It's kind of quite interesting and quite unexpected, actually.
Yeah. No, I can imagine. Thanks. That's really helpful. More broadly, from a G320 perspective, what barriers do smaller housing associations face in retrofitting their stock?
I think, as I say, many small housing associations are kind of at the start of this. I think generally in London, probably smaller housing associations have older and harder to treat stock than average because we haven't been building lots of new homes over the last 20 years. I think on the plus side, because we haven't been building those homes, there may be a bit more financial capacity in business plans because we haven't got the huge fire remediation bills that some of the larger ones have, although we have got some. I think the biggest challenge is around sort of in-house capacity, it's the skills and the expertise within the organisation. My organisation's got 14 staff. I've got one person, and that's one asset manager. And it's about taking that kind of strategic view about kind of retrofit and delivery. It's a big span of skills and knowledge, and capacity to deliver. Really, I think that's one of the big challenge. And I think I'll just add one more thing, which is just about the funding packages that are in there. As somebody said, you know, really complex, a plethora of different schemes. They've often got very short time scales. You need specialist teams to bid for them. So finding ways of collaborating, you know, together to actually help us access funding is something that's really important.
Thank you. Thanks. That's really helpful. I'm going to move over to Adam, if that's okay. Hi. So Camden has around 30,000 homes that need retrofit in the borough, and it will cost about £1 billion. £1 billion. So can you see a clear path to achieving this, and how much could be achieved with the resources currently at your disposal?
Yeah, thanks. I think, similar to what Susan said, I wouldn't quite say we're at the start, but I think of this process, but there's still a lot that we are working through to understand how to meet that financial challenge. And putting aside the potential difficulties around supply and labour supply and skills and so on, that financial challenge is absolutely crucial. Probably within our own resources, we wouldn't be able to fund that.
I'm sorry, can you
Sorry.
speak up a
Yeah,
tiny
sorry.
bit more? I think your microphone's lower than the rest of ours, but if you can really project at it,
That's
that'd be
better.
amazing.
I think I can hear myself better now. Yeah, certainly within our own resources, I think we wouldn't be able to fund it all, so we would be looking for other sources of funding, and there's a variety of locations for that. I think the government, as well as simplifying the funding streams and providing more certainty, by which I also mean probably less grant bidding processes and looking for ways in which streams can be opened up for local authorities and probably housing associations and others to draw down on directly would be extremely helpful, and would have that wider beneficial impact of stimulating the market. So certainly direct support from the government, but we are also looking at what other models we could apply within our own housing. So thinking about our leaseholders who own around a third of the stock on leasehold that we have as freehold. We have successfully trialled measures in the past. For example, we created a decentralised energy network next to the Royal Free Hospital in one of our estates, and that's connected to around 1,500 homes, and set up a 14-year kind of recharge arrangement for our leaseholders. So we do have some experience of innovating on that. But I think greater guidance and greater work from the government and others. Green Finance Institute was mentioned, who I think are looking at trialling a number of quite a few different types of models, bringing forward some of that guidance, testing those out as rapidly as we can, and settling on some new powers that we could apply within our own stock would be extremely helpful in terms of us being able to work out what finance we can unlock locally to help fund some of the works that we want to undertake. And then just finally, we need to look at combining retrofit works with the other works that we're going to be doing anyway. So our regular maintenance works, increasingly our fire safety works. This is certainly something that's happened over the years already. We've been, we do retrofit as we go, but I think there is a new energy, and there's a new kind of political will now to look more carefully at making sure we are retrofitting as much as we can.
Thank you. Can I also ask, as I asked Susan, obviously given the urgency of the climate emergency, but also the disruption that there will be for tenants, how do you foresee, or how do you foresee engaging with your tenants through that process?
It certainly could be a challenging process. I think leaseholders certainly are concerned. I've been contacted lately by some of our leaseholder representatives, worried about the impacts that they think they may be able to face. But I think that's really why we need, as quickly as possible, to be able to provide some solutions. There is certainly strong, as Susan said, interest and support for those sorts of measures. Actually, when we undertook a citizens' assembly on the climate emergency a couple of years ago, retrofitting our stock and removing fossil fuels from our own properties was was one of the recommendations that the citizens made. But it will be when we get down to the finer detail of how that's paid for, that we want to be able to provide some of that reassurance up front. We want to be able to draw down on those models, such as the ones we trialled, which I mentioned about the 14-year payback, but we want to be able to present those and talk through those options with our residents as soon as we can.
Okay, thanks. And to both of you, if that's okay, have you experienced any issues with the quality of retrofit projects within your stock? Adam, I think it's first.
We've actually had quite good experience, I'd say, overall. But I think, again, just to go back to the kind of accreditation industry standards that do exist, we would like to see those taken up more broadly by the industry.
We haven't got to that point yet.
Do you have any feedback from any of the other small housing associations that within G320? Or?
No, not from smalls particularly. I think the only thing I would say is that, you know, on some new build properties where we've got technology like air source heat pumps, you know, there is a which will be the technology that we have to end up retrofitting into our existing stock. I think there's a real piece around you know, occupants getting used to what that means for how people live in their homes, because it operates quite differently to traditional kind of gas boilers. So, you know, there's a bit of a gap there, I would say, in terms of performance. Yeah.
That's interesting. Thank you. Thanks.
There's a question about smaller firms.
I thought you covered that earlier on.
Well, we asked Shirley and whether or not the scheme from the GLA, the partnership project, was excluding smaller firms. I just wanted to sort of see if any of you have experience of small versus large firms in terms of delivering it. I think, Adam, when you answered that question there, you were answering about retrofit pilots and things like that, as opposed to the overall repairs and maintenance. Because obviously Shirley earlier on talked about the unlocking the £10 million market through the innovation partnership idea. A lot of that was based on using regular maintenance done by local authorities as a kind of proxy for retrofit. And obviously regular maintenance is done by different firms than generally do the super green work, if that's a reasonable technical term to use. Does that make sense? So yes, that is. I mean, the question is, you know, do you find in general that smaller firms offer potentially better quality service, given that the work we've seen about retrofit says that most of the work is labour rather than tech and technology?
I'm afraid I think the officers who deal with the firms more directly may know that. It's not something I've heard that there's one is better than the other. Certainly, what I'd hope for in the future, as we kind of stimulate and create that industry, is that there would be a range of firms, that there would be local firms. We certainly know that within Camden, some of the skills we're looking for, where they do exist at the moment, and there is a shortage in London, they're largely not based in Camden, they're largely in East London and elsewhere. We don't have to be so local that we demand everything in one place. I think it would be healthy to have a London-wide skill set, skilled workforce to be able to draw on, and for that to be mobile across the capital. But I think through our procurement processes in the past, through our planning processes as well, we've always in Camden been quite successful in generating, securing local employment, and I'd hope that we could foster that as well in terms of new firms, smaller firms and specialist firms who are able to deliver the work that we need.
Yeah, I think that's the general hope, is that a recovery will involve a green recovery will involve new firms springing up. And I'm just slightly worried that the model of having very large companies who subcontract the work may be just replicated with this. I hope that makes sense to other members. Bradley, is there anything you wanted to add on any of these questions around local authorities and sort of markets and resources available to them? And
not on that specifically, but what I would say just around London is that you really do need to look at the different tenures and the fact that the private rented sector is so much higher in London than the rest of the country. So I think London will potentially take a slightly different approach than the rest of England.
Okay, that's really helpful. So moving on to essentially the final section of questions. I've got Assembly Member Boff to ask more along these kinds of lines.
Yeah, just to carry on from what was said, of course, the introduction of rent controls is going to introduce a problem, isn't it, for private landlords to retrofit their properties?
Yes, it could potentially. RICS is not necessarily. We're not in favour of rent controls. So, but as to the exact impact that will cause, I'm not sure. I can certainly get back to you on that.
Thank you. Also, we've got another challenge as well in terms of taller buildings. I mean, we're currently removing cladding from lots of tall buildings, and the reason that the cladding was put there was because towers are so very inefficient in terms of energy. Do you think there's going to be a problem in the future? There's going to be a problem retrofitting those tall buildings?
I think we really need to look at it as an opportunity to do both, because both are fundamentally important. Cladding remediation work is important from a building safety point of view, and retrofitting work is fundamentally important from a long-term sustainability point of view in terms of people and the planet. So I think any opportunity where we can look at how remediation work in terms of cladding and further work in terms of, for instance, installing solar PV panels on high-rise buildings can take place concurrently is something that should.
But they're a much harder challenge, are they not? We heard at our Planning and Regen Committee, and I know we overlap a lot, only last year, that if you go from 6 stories to 20 stories, the energy intensity per square metres is doubled. And that must create a real problem when you're trying to retrofit down to 0.
Yes, I think I don't know on that point specifically, but I think there will certainly be challenges that need to be looked at.
And Councillor Harrison, do you see any problems within your stock at the moment of I don't know how many tall buildings you have? Do you see any particular problems there with retrofitting that typology of building?
Yeah, they will come with their own greater costs. We are actually recladding a number of them at the moment in light of fire safety concerns. So that's an example of being able to bring some of that benefit together at the same time.
Is that cladding going to bring those buildings down to what is required for a net zero?
Well, I think net zero entails a whole range of other things which aren't being delivered by the cladding replacement. So we'd have to look at, as we've already heard many times, all the other contributors to that, whether it's the energy source or the windows.
Do you feel that you might have to reclad in order to meet net zero over and above what you're cladding at the moment?
Not particularly. I mean, this cladding will last a number of decades. So, if you take a given building like that, you would be looking at then implementing some of those other measures I just mentioned first to be able to do that.
So you don't anticipate a situation where the cladding of a building will prove a challenge in terms of energy efficiency?
No, I mean the cladding we'll be using is the most up to date, and as with this whole picture, the technology is moving on all the time. Right.
So, are the demands on yourselves to retrofit going to affect your ability to deliver new homes?
No, I don't think so. That remains a hugely important political priority for us to be building new, genuinely affordable housing, alongside delivering fire safety works, and now this hugely important political ambition we've also taken on to decarbonise our housing stock, which it's 25% across for all our housing. It's 25% of the borough. It's 10% of our own direct stock. So it's not a challenge that we can shy away from.
It's not a challenge, even though it's going to cost you a lot.
it will certainly cost a lot, as we've heard, which is why we need to draw upon all these different sources of finance that will be available. You know, what's likely at the moment is these clearer frameworks, is these models and mechanisms that we can all be applying. Councils need to be empowered to be given the powers to do this, to apply these locally with their communities. So there needs to be, this is why I say there needs to be a range of options available so we can select the right ones. But it would be extremely helpful if the government would, set that framework. I actually think that's something the GLA can be really useful in, is to kind of make the case for London because of our own distinctive type of housing stock that we have, and to press that case for London local authorities to have those powers and to have the funding available to them.
You can rest assured we make that case all the time in terms of devolution of powers to London and their boroughs. Ms French, does it prove a challenge for you to expand?
When we did our first estimates, which were an average of £25,000 per home, when we plugged that into our 30-year business plan, it basically wiped out all of our development capacity that we had. So we had capacity to build about 40 homes, and that money would all be spent on retrofitting. I mean, obviously that doesn't take any grant funding into account, and we very much hope we'll be able to get that in, but it has a big impact on our ability to deliver new homes.
That's rather worrying, bearing in mind you've got there are so many demands for new homes. Do you think the right balance is being struck between ensuring quality retrofit whilst recognising the need to deliver quickly at scale? Would you like to see changes? I mean, do you think the quality of retrofit might be being affected because of the demands of getting it done quickly? And silence came over the room, so nobody really wants to.
I think we heard the opposite earlier on, which is essentially from Shirley, certainly, that they're working hard to get pilot schemes sort of very right because they haven't got the capacity to roll it out. So instead, they're working on improving the pilots. Does that make sense?
I don't think there is any speed. I mean, since the Code for Sustainable Homes was abolished, I think it's just been really, really slow. I mean, it's just not really happening.
So it's getting better, but slower. It's the opposite of, I think.
It's just insignificant these days, I'm sorry to say.
To Mr Tully, investing in the retrofit of the social sector is a good place to start building the industry, but sooner rather than later homeowners in the private rented sector will require an increase in retrofit works. How can these tenures be encouraged, bearing in mind they're being asked to do a lot of other stuff at the same time?
Yes, well, I think there are a number of ways that we can sort of encourage change in the owner-occupier sector or the private sector. I think regulation from central government is one of the best ways of encouraging consumer change. But there's also other things that can be done in terms of green finance initiatives and other initiatives. Mortgage lenders can play a role, for instance, through offering green lending for home improvement work. In our policy paper last year, I think we also said that government could potentially support a home improvement ISA or things like that, things that encourage behavioural change and consumer change. Incidentally, we also recently published a RICS low carbon consumer guide, just around the sort of practical steps that consumers can take to lower their bills and improve rates of fuel poverty. So I'd be happy to send that to the committee as well, and would really welcome any endorsement from the committee in terms of publicising that and pushing that out more broadly, because there is an issue around funding and skills and all these issues, but there's also an issue around how we change consumer behaviour across all kinds of tenures.
Do you think there's a danger that regulation that you mentioned might actually result in fewer people wanting to get involved in the housing business?
No, I not necessarily. I think it really is about bringing people along and taking a holistic approach. I think if you're engaging with industry, if you're engaging with the financial sector, then I think that people won't fear change.
And Councillor Harrison, you alluded earlier to leaseholders, and you effectively answered my first question on that, so thank you very much for anticipating that. However, do you find that there are some lease terms that pose a barrier to retrofitting?
I think it depends what type of measure you're trying to implement. Like I said before, we've certainly been introducing insulation and windows replacement as part of our general works program and so on. I think when you start to get into it's something we're still looking at really, but I think when you start to get into replacing gas powered heating with air source heat pumps or ground source heat pumps or so on, and the costs are quite significant. I think that's something we're still trying to tackle really, and there could well be obstacles.
Yeah. Some of us have a view that leaseholders are asked to pay enough already, really, and if we're just asking them to pay more and more and more, it seems unfair, really.
Perhaps. Maybe I should say here, I'm a Camden leaseholder, just to be clear. But I think I think the vision is clear that we do need to be decarbonising our housing stock. It's a question of how we do that. I think Shirley mentioned the Energy Strong initiative earlier, and there are other similar models where you can allow leaseholders. Ideally, this is how it would work. You would allow leaseholders to pay some sort of a regular charge to account for and to help fund works that need to be undertaken over time. That's another kind of more constant income stream that you could start to apply to allow councils and probably other property owners to be able to undertake these necessary works.
And just before we go, because I'm going to want to have it, do you anticipate Camden being tempted to build more tall buildings, bearing in mind the inherent problems that there are with...
Very much a planning committee question, Assemblyman.
It's not the planning. I just wondered whether or not...
If you can answer very, very quickly.
The government seems to be wanting to encourage us to build tall buildings and to
not
say
asking
where
the
they're going to
government.
go.
I know they're faulty for you. Do you think you're going to be building more?
Not to fund retrofit.
What to do with retrofit, Chair?
Hasn't really. I'm indulging you for one moment.
The problem with tall buildings is that they are inherently energy inefficient. And if we carry on building
we are definitely
them,
focused on retrofit today. So.
Sorry?
I think we can all agree on Andrew's point, though.
But you did say building new tall buildings.
You did,
which
exactly.
I do understand.
Yes.
Sorry, I mean, obviously we might need to retrofit them in some years' time, but they're
Well,
not
we've
actually...
heard today
members, can we come to order so we can try and finish the meeting?
Already,
Thank you.
I just keep sitting through committees where people talk randomly about anything they're interested in.
It was going so well, wasn't it, Chair?
Okay,
go on,
members,
Chair.
Let's move on.
Chair, we have heard today already that we are building homes that will require now...
That is a very good point, which I very much allowed you to...
Yeah. And on the same line of argument, I'm saying this is entirely consistent. Are we now building homes, high-rise homes, that will require retrofitting in the future?
Yeah, and it was a really good question about...
If so, don't you think we should stop it and start to reflect that these tall buildings are creating problems for the future and will need retrofit?
Members, can I bring the... I'm really sorry, Andrew, I know you're talking very eloquently there, but I've got to bring the meeting
tall buildings
to order. And the same goes for you, Assemblymember Cooper. Thank you. I wanted to ask one very quick wrap-up question to Councillor Harrison, which is, earlier on the Innovation Partnership, Shirley listed the councils that are part of it, and Camden isn't. Could you very briefly tell us why not?
I'm not. I can't exactly answer that directly, but what I can say is we are working with other councils, with Hackney and Islington and Lambeth, to develop partnership working on skills and on funding. So we are collaborating with other boroughs to be able to devise the solutions for the future. So I think that kind of regional and sub-regional model is going to be really important, because it's something we're hoping to develop so that we can procure at scale, so we can work together at scale on working with contractors, working with further education providers and so on to bring together all the pieces of this puzzle.
Okay, so it's not that you're against it, you're just not in it yet, as it were.
No, they're certainly not against it. I think, I know Camden's officers are collaborating at a number of levels in a number of different formats with London councils, with the GLA. It's possible that they were at capacity when they were offered the opportunity, and I'm afraid I don't know why we're not part of it directly. But like I say, there is a huge amount of partnership working going forward that we really want to ramp up so we can deliver on this challenge, which isn't going fast enough at the moment, which is perhaps why we were stumped by an earlier question. It is good that we're also doing some whole property deep retrofit as well, similar to some of the work that Shirley mentioned. But really the challenge is about how to scale up and ramp up as quickly as possible.
Okay, thank you. And then just very quickly to Bradley, you mentioned you've produced a guide for I think landlords and homeowners, people who might be interested to do works. And I was just really interested in what Susan had said about there being this 20-step process to apply, and knowing that the Green Homes grants and other ways of doing things are a barrier. But on the sort of, and I'm going to leak into planning now, on the planning permission side of things, do you find that that's a barrier? Because I certainly, as a local councillor dealing with casework in my ward, sometimes find that one of the major barriers people have is the worry that they won't get planning permission, they're in a conservation area. Certainly with solar panels, which I know Shirley has said very much is, if you can't get down the energy use, then make the energy you use renewable. That's one of the ways of bringing down the carbon of a home. If your solar panels face the road when they're facing south, you don't have the plan. So all those things might be barriers. Does your guide aim to deal with those, and are they significant for people who might otherwise be funding it themselves?
Yeah, well, the guide that we produced is very sort of high level about the very basic steps that you can take, and also says that the kind of more extensive work that you can do and in terms of retrofitting and the expertise that you can call on to get guidance on that. In terms of the exact kind of planning decisions and rules, I'm not entirely sure on that, so I can certainly get back to you on that when I send across this guide. But I certainly think that there probably is a level of consumer sort of hesitance about what they are and aren't allowed to do in their own home. So yes, I think as much as we can create clarity on that as possible is very welcome.
And Susan, you mentioned something about the heritage buildings that you have. Do you think some kind of, discussion about heritage and conservation changes and rules and ways of doing it that are compatible and things might be a useful thing to do?
I think it's absolutely essential. I really do. And I think, I'm speaking to another much bigger landlord, that they're having a discussion with one of their local authorities about, can you treat the front of properties and the back of properties differently? I know the area where we work, that's not something where there's a dialogue opening up at the minute, but I think it's absolutely essential because the messages we're getting are the heritage trumps everything else, and and that's I don't think that's sustainable in the long term.
I mean, it doesn't even have to be an either or in some cases as well. It can be, we'll think about that. And then finally, to you, Bradley, you've talked, and we've all talked a number of times about the fact there is a skills gap. Is there anything you can do for us today to put some numbers on that in terms of the significance of it to the ability to achieve the targets, but also how many jobs? I think the Mayor mentioned 150,000 jobs. Is that a good number?
I don't have exact figures about what we need. I think similar to the issue of funding, it's we recognise that it's significant, and there are different views about what the exact. Can you
put an order of magnitude? Is it tens of thousands of people need to be trained, or is it hundreds of thousands?
I wouldn't like to hazard a guess that might be slightly out, but I can give you. I'm sure I can get back to you and give you a rough estimate of what we expect. But I think that there are things that government again can do. So, for instance, temporarily cutting VAT on home improvement work, which currently favours new build, to 5%. That's something that we and other organisations have pushed for, and we have said that that could create, tens of thousands of green jobs and, an economic stimulus as well. So there are things that can be done in order to try and create that demand. But in terms of skills, we also need to kind of build up the knowledge, and RICS professionals are upskilling, and there's more that needs to be done in terms of improving the skills of installers, engineers, estate agents, surveyors. There's lots of people in the mix.
And so you can't put any numbers on the number of training places, the number of new tutors, the number of...
I'll certainly get back to you on that.
Yeah.
It's not my area.
Okay. No, if you can find out for us, that would be really interesting. I imagine the whole picture is incredibly complicated by the gap in people coming from other countries to work here as well. There's a very uncertain... coronavirus and Brexit and all of those things interact with those.
That certainly had an impact on supply chains and labour as well.
Ready trained people may not be available to do the training. These are questions. Susan, you wanted to say something?
I was just going to add one thing about that, which was a piece of work that is being done as part of the NatFed work. Says that this is nationally, to get to net zero by 2050, 3,500 homes have to be retrofitted every week. And so I don't know what the numbers actually being retrofitted are, but it's probably 1% of that. So that just gives some idea of the challenge, I suppose, in terms of...
In terms of the skills gap, is there anything that is missing at a London level? The Mayor is working on skills academies. There's a recovery programme being put together. Is there anything you think could be done without government funding at the London level that we could encourage the Mayor to do? That's open to anyone who's just thought of anything that we might be doing. No. Well, go on.
I was just going to say, I think funding being made available to support apprenticeships, to support training courses at a local level throughout the network of construction centres that exist, or throughout all the further education colleges that we have, would be a helpful component of that wider picture of the sector ramping up, the sector expanding, of hopefully the creation of more new local companies. There isn't the capacity at the moment to deliver what we need to. So some kind of prime funding within that kind of FE sector would be extremely helpful. And there'll be a variety of forms that could take. But the apprenticeships pathway is not terribly clear into retrofit at the moment, and there'll be actually, I think, with at the moment there's a lack of electricians, scaffolders, all sorts of construction workers, but there's likely to be a lack of specialists in the whole house deeper retrofit challenge that we're going to have to deliver on as well. So I think make sure that those newer skills are more available as well would be helpful to support those financially.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And the thing about apprenticeships is they need to be with firms that already exist. You don't train, you train on the job. So that would be something we could do with those firms that we have in partnership, potentially. Okay, I think that we've reached it. Is there anything else I should be? Any other members want to ask any more?
I'd only talk about tall buildings, so I won't bother.
We can take that up in appropriate committees, Assembly Member Boff. Right, and I have to finish. Thank you so much to our guests. That is the first bit of formal business to say. Thank you to Shirley, who spent a good amount of time with us, James, who was online, Susan, Bradley, and Adam for spending so much time with us. Members, can we note the report that we received ahead of today's discussion and the discussion that we've had, and can we delegate authority to meet as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output from today's work?
Agreed.
I'd like to agree that, but can we definitely agree that we will make some of the outputs to right concerning the increase in the minimum energy efficiency standard contributions, and also to contribute to the review of the Decent Home Standard, which came up as two areas. I think it would be really helpful given the...
This is the landlord's contribution question, the cap on the landlord contribution.
It's about them putting something into retrofitting. It is something that we agreed previously that we felt that it should be increased from 3.5k to 5k. So it would be building on our previous proposal from before, which I'm sure the committee clerks can tell us which committee.
Was it this committee?
Well, I think we actually passed it as a resolution also in the Assembly, which
That's
might have
helpful
been,
to know.
might
Let
have
me
been
just-
moved by myself and Tom Copley, for example, but also the changes to the Decent Home Standard is business critical to improving retrofit, I think, particularly with looking at the climate aspects as well, as Shirley mentioned. So it would be really good if we could write about that as well, Chair. Thank you.
I'm not against that. I just need to check before we can agree as a committee with the other members from the other party.
Writing what exactly?
To write, well, when we decide what we're going to write to ministers, we include supporting the lifting of the cap on landlord contributions to energy efficiency, which we already did once to 5,000.
We did, after a resolution was passed at the Assembly.
We can save it to discuss later if we can't agree
We can-
today. We're just seeing if we can get consensus right now.
Well, I think if you're in favour of it, Chair, we
Can we
probably have
do
a
this
majority.
we'll do this outside the committee.
Okay, we will just check in offline and make a decision finally. But I would be happy to continue discussing that. But we do need to delegate authority to meet as chair to do all of that. Are you happy to do that, members?
Yes.
Thank you. Also to note, and the final item, the near final item on the agenda, item 10, the work programme, which is on the agenda, and also the additional activity we've done since the last meeting, including the informal briefing with the Safe Homes for Women Leaving Prison initiative and our survey on housing during the pandemic. Can we delegate authority to me as chair, in consultation with party group lead members, to also agree later on this summer the Affordable Housing Monitor for publication?
Agreed.
Thank you very much. The date of the next meeting of the committee is now confirmed as at 10 o'clock in the morning on the 19th of October 2021 here in the chamber. And finally, I have no other urgent business and I can declare the meeting to be closed and thank all of you for coming.